Hi, I'm Stan Goldman from Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, and I'm here in Delray Beach, Florida, at the home of Ben Ferencz, who has graciously allowed us to come in and ask him a few questions today, and also discuss with him the Raphael Lemkin Award, of which he is this year's recipient. Ben, how are you today?
Fine. And the trick to that is to, if you want to be always fine, think of the alternatives. When I do that, I have every reason to be content every day.
Speaking of the alternatives, you were in the American Army during World War II, and in the waning days of the war, when it was almost over, you had the experience of being there at a concentration camp when it was basically being liberated. Could you discuss that for a moment?
Well, it wasn't a casual visit. I had graduated from the Harvard Law School. I had done the research for a professor there, Sheldon Gluck, on a book on war crimes. The Army had immediately recognized that talent, and they made me a private in the artillery. Typical Army. But by the time we got toward the end of the war, we began running into the German concentration camps. And the President of the United States and Churchill and Stalin as well had promised that there would be war crimes trials. And so I was reassigned from the artillery to the judge advocate section of General Patton's army. I met a colonel there who said, "What's a war crime?" And I believe I was the first man in the United States Army to deal with war crimes. And one of the assignments, in addition to digging up Allied flyers, American flyers had been shot down and beaten by the mob, was to go into the concentration camps as they were being liberated and collect evidence of the crimes so that we could have trials against the mass murderers who were responsible for all the dead bodies who were lying on the ground when I came in to the crematoria, which was still burning when I came in. So it wasn't just a casual visit. I was there on business of the United States, which led to the subsequent war crimes trials.
Were you able to document these in a way that was eventually used at the trial?
Some of the documentation was incredible and very fortunate. For example, I seized immediately everything in the Schreibstube, the office, which were registers of the people who were in the camp, what transports had arrived, how many people had died by nationality and number. The numbers have been assigned in Auschwitz on tattoo on their arm. But we had something like the following, which I think is worth noting. One of the inmates was responsible for issuing new cards to a club which existed at the camp. And when the club members had used up the thing, they had to issue a new card. So he had kept the cards which he was expected in order to destroy. He had kept them and saved them in a box, which he had buried near the electrified fence. And when I came into his office, the office in the camp, he said, "I've been waiting for you, come with me." Took me to the electrified fence, dug up a wooden box, took it out, and there he had, and handed over to me, the portrait of every SS guard who'd been in that camp, giving his name, place of birth, his address, and so on. And every time he saved that card, he took his life into his own hands. And he did it deliberately, knowing and feeling that one day there would be a day of reckoning. And that was the day. So that was a priceless piece of evidence, as well as a beautiful illustration of human courage in the face of adversity and willingness to run risks in order to do the right thing and to bring to justice the criminals.
Now, where were you born?
I was born in a little village in Transylvania, which there is such a place. So was my wife, to whom I've been happily wed for 70 years. My parents immigrated to the United States. I was an infant at the time. They were two young immigrant people. My sister was born a year and a half before me. She's Hungarian. I was born in the same bed. A year and a half later, I'm Romanian. An indication that the borders and what you call them is not so significant. It's how you treat the people that's significant, not the name of the place. And we were poor immigrants in the United States. My father had no skills which could be translated here. And we lived in poverty most of our lives.
How old were you when you came?
I was 9 months old. My parents and my sister was a year and a half older. My father had no employment. He had been trained to do handmade shoes, which they didn't need. My mother had the two little infant children. We were lucky to get a job as a janitor in a house. We could sleep in the cellar. And that's my earliest memories, begin in Hell's Kitchen in a cellar.
Did you learn any foreign languages, by the way, when you were?
When I was a boy, I cried with a Hungarian accent. The other languages that developed, I learned to speak French and I learned to speak German eventually. But it's not the language that you speak, but what you say that's more important.
Well, what were you speaking in the camp?
Well, the prisoners, I spoke German. I was an American soldier, but I could speak German to them, but there was a varied nationality in the camps. There were a lot of Hungarians in the camps too, but there was mixed nationality. The language of choice was English. I wore the uniform of the United States. I was then a sergeant of infantry working in the judge advocate section.
And is that how you ended up at Nuremberg as a clerk, as an assistant?
I stayed on in Germany for a brief time until they could get me out. I was eager to go home as soon as the war was over. I had joined the army in order to help win the war. We won the war. I said, I'm going home. And I did go home. I received a telegram from the Pentagon, dear sir. They had never called me sir in 3 years. And I had been doing the research for the subsequent military commission trials, which were set up in the Dachau concentration camps, trials about which very little is known. But I was then hired in the Pentagon to go back for the trials which were planned after the International Military Tribunal case. That was the big international Nuremberg trial. The United States had decided that we ought to have additional trials because that small sampling of just a few leaders didn't tell the whole story.
The famous one, the Goering, for example.
Well, Goering was a big name, yes, but we still had to understand how it was that an educated country like Germany could tolerate all these crimes. We wanted the doctors to explain why they performed medical experiments on innocent victims. We wanted the judges to explain why they perverted the law for political purposes. We wanted the SS to explain why they murdered millions of people, including hundreds of thousands of children. We wanted the industrialists to explain how come they worked people to death in their various factories of IG Farben and Siemens and AEG and other famous German names. We gave them an opportunity there to state their case, and if found guilty of crime, to be dealt with accordingly.
What was your position at the beginning when you went to Nuremberg?
When I came back to Nuremberg, I was assigned by General Telford Taylor, who was appointed by the President Truman at the time, to head all these subsequent trials. He sent me to Berlin. He said, look, man, you know all about investigations. You've been doing it during the war. Set up a group, which I did, of about 50 people, to go through all the German archives in Berlin. Berlin had been largely destroyed, but they had so many copies of different things that we could find it, if not in one office. The Gestapo building had been destroyed, but the Foreign Ministry had not, the Air Force was not, that we were able to dig into the archives with a trained group of former German refugees mostly, and Jewish refugees, victims of persecution, and collect the evidence which we sent down to Nuremberg for the trials which were in preparation. After doing that, one of my researchers found special reports of extermination squads. No one could either pronounce it or translate it. Einsatzgruppen. Literally, it means action groups. And there we had daily reports from the field of these troops which came behind the German lines, and as they would put it, we made the areas secure, which meant you murder in cold blood every single Jewish man, woman, and child you can lay your hands on. You do the same to the gypsies. You do the same to any commissars or people who might threaten you. And these reports, daily from the front, top secret, were combined into big folders, and I had all the folders and all the reports.
What was the total when you got to the bottom?
I took a little adding machine, and I began to add them on my machine. When I reached 1 million, I stopped. I took a sampling. I flew down from Berlin to Nuremberg. I said, General Taylor, we have to put on a new trial. Here I have clear-cut, documentary, contemporaneous documents proving murder of over 1 million people, and I know the names of the commanders, I know the time, I know the place, I have the documents here. You've got to put on a new trial. He said, we can't put on a new trial because the Pentagon has already approved only 12 trials, and we don't have budget, and all the lawyers have already been assigned, the trials are beginning, we can't do it. I said, you can't let these guys go, and I was rather insistent. Taylor, who was a very fine gentleman, also a Harvard lawyer, later my law partner, he said, can you do it in addition to your other work? I said, sure. So he said, okay, you're it. So I became the chief prosecutor of what was...
What was your rank, by the way, at this point in time?
Well, at that point, when I got out of the Army, I was a sergeant of infantry. They gave me 5 battle stars for not having been killed in the landings at Normandy, in the final Battle of the Bulge, and so on. But it was still a sergeant of infantry, honorable discharge with 5 battle stars. That was also very rare to have survived that much. But when I went back, I was first assimilated rank. So I wouldn't go back into the Army. I didn't trust them. Assimilated rank of colonel, but when I got this assignment, I was promoted to general. So I went from sergeant to general in about 4 months'
And
time.
how old were you when you became
Well, by that time I was already an old man. I was 27, 28, you know, and so...
How old were you when you graduated law school, by the way?
I was 23. I graduated in 1943. When I was, how old, let's see, I was 90, I'm now 95. When I was 95, the dean of the Harvard Law School gave me their highest medal, and I was delighted because the predecessor had been Nelson Mandela. And so I had moved during that brief interval from having gotten a doctor's degree from Harvard Law School and to being given their highest honor. So, but anyway, I'm back there. That was my first case, and the biggest murder trial in human history.
First case, you've never...
I never had tried a case in my life. I had gotten out of law school. Of course, I was interested in crime prevention as a career. So I knew all about crime, I knew all about war crimes, having done the research at the library and so on. And so my first case was the biggest murder trial in human history.
This was a tragic fulfillment of a program of intolerance and arrogance. Vengeance is not our goal.
Nor do we seek merely a just retribution. With no experience whatsoever. And then in addition, I was so inexperienced that I rested my case after 2 days. I didn't call a single witness. I said, why do I need a witness? Witnesses contradict themselves. Witnesses are confused on cross-examination. I had 1,000 potential witnesses who would swear that this particular defendant killed his mother. But I said, I'm not getting into that. I don't need it. I have the contemporaneous document. I knew enough about law, and I knew enough about evidence. I said, this is sufficient evidence.
And under international law, the law that the tribunal at Nuremberg was being used, the rules on hearsay that we might have thrown out in America or kept out.
Well, it wasn't hearsay. This was documentary proofs, contemporaneous document certified as top secret with official stamps on it. That's not hearsay. That's the best evidence you can get.
Okay.
I wanted to avoid hearsay by not calling a witness.
No contradictions. Nobody misremembering.
Well, I had so many. No, well, of course I wasn't there. I was at my grandmother's funeral, in which case I had to have a further investigation done and find proof that he didn't have a grandmother. You know, so we had a lot of that. The trial itself lasted about 5 months while they came with their phony alibis, and I tore them to shreds because what I had. They couldn't disprove.
So a 2-day prosecution,
yes.
Basically a 5-month defense, and,
yes.
and each time they would come up with
They were
something.
all convicted. 13 of them were sentenced to death. They had never matched that record again either. I wanted to make it clear what the purpose of the trial was, because these 22 defendants were responsible for murdering over 1 million people. And I couldn't think of any punishment which would be a balance for that kind of a crime. And my feeling was, rather than asking that these 22 people be hanged or shot, which would be insignificant, Plenty of murderers still left. There were 30,000 members of the Einsatzgruppe, and every day went out and shot Jewish men, women, and children. But I thought if I could establish a principle of law, that would protect human beings everywhere. And I put into that the philosophy that I have, the right of all human beings to live in peace and human dignity, regardless of their race or creed. And it was my plea of humanity to accept law as the way of settling their disputes. And I've been working on it ever since, and it hasn't changed. The men in the dock, approximately, were the cruel executioners whose terror wrote the blackest page in human history. Life was their toy, and death was their tool. If these men be immune, then law has lost its meaning, and man must live in fear. I think that was my last word. And that was quoted just about 50 years almost to the day by Judge Antonio Cassese when he was president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And he quoted that in his address, his report to the Security Council at the General Assembly of the United Nations. I hadn't met him then. Later we shared the very prestigious Erasmus Prize given by the Queen, now the King of Holland. So the words lived on 50 years later, and he quoted just that sentence. I did not ask any sentence. And that was a surprise. As a matter of fact, a French newspaper quoted me as saying, "Je vous demande leur tête." I had to ask for their heads, which I never said and would never say. I didn't ask for any sentence because there was no sentence that would be appropriate to inflict on these people, which would say, well, justice was done. No justice was done. It was a sampling of justice. There were 3,000 members of the Einsatzgruppe who went out every day with the assignment, and which they carried out gladly because they bragged about the body count, murdered Jewish men, women, and children, including children shot one shot at a time, including children taken with their heads bashed against a tree in order to save ammunition, shooting children who were to be shot while the mothers held them to their breasts on instructions from Otto Ohlendorf, my lead defendant. He said, you save ammunition, you quiet the mother, aim for the baby, aim for the infant. I had prepared a sheet, which the Holocaust Museum has, and they show it, a yellow pad, in which I had the name of the defendants, and on the left-hand side, I wrote down what I thought the sentence would be. And I came to the courtroom early. I was the only one in the courtroom when it opened in the morning. And I sat by myself at the prosecutor's table. I put the pad in front of me and I waited for the proceedings to begin. I was not waiting with glee, now I'm going to get him, or anything of that kind. It was a somber experience. The whole trial was a somber experience. And then the defendants came in. The first one was Otto Ohlendorf, and the courtroom is so structured that it's on top of the prison, which is right down below the court. And the prisoners are brought from the prison below in a lift, which comes up, it's a sort of, it goes up and around, it goes around constantly. And it stops at the floor. The doors into the courtroom, you can't know that it's a door to a lift or anything. It looks like a ordinary door. The door slides open. The defendants step forward about 2 steps, put on the earphones, and nod to the judges that they have the earphones on. And then the Chief Judge, Michael Musmano, Superior Court of Pennsylvania, says, Otto Ohlendorf, for the crimes of which you have been convicted, this tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. He takes the earphones off, Ohlendorf, puts it on the side, nods, steps backward, the door closes, and zoom, he disappears. Next defendant. For the crimes of which you have been convicted, this court sentences you to death by hanging. Down. Next one, death by hanging. Down. And I'm writing this on the thing, hanging. I think I had felt that some of them would be hanged. I don't remember anymore which ones are which, but my head began throbbing. Death by hanging, so a hammer would be hitting me in the head. I had a splitting headache when it was over, and it was customary at Nuremberg that the chief prosecutor, at the end of a trial, to celebrate the end of the trial, regardless of the outcome, invited his whole staff, the secretaries, translators, investigators, typists, to come to his home for a celebration that the trial was over. And I had such a party planned in my house in Nuremberg. I had such a headache. I never had a headache like that before or after since, that I went and I said, I'm sorry, I cannot join you. I went to bed. So the analysis of that I leave to psychiatrists. But that is a clear description of my very clear memory of that day.
Now after, so how long did you stay at Nuremberg? When did you get?
Well, winning the war, which was my first obligation, and then holding accountable the criminals, which was my second, left with a third obligation. What about the victims? The world is inclined to say, well, forget about the victims, it's not our business. No, that was not my position. So at the urging of some leading Jewish organizations, I agreed to stay on in Germany, which I didn't want to do. My wife was with me. She wanted to go home too, to New York. I set up all the restitution programs in Germany. A treaty between Germany and Israel and the Claims Conference, which I represented at those meetings. It was also unique in history, a treaty between a state which didn't exist at the time the crimes committed, had a private organization, and then I set up a legal aid society to help the victims with the claims. The claims were very complicated. There were 1 million claims. You could claim various things, and it covered Jews as well as non-Jews. It was open to all claimants. So I set up those three things that was taking care of the victims. That still leaves me with the most important thing, and that is preventing it from happening again. And that's why I'm still here, and that's why I'm still alive.
Well, let me ask you one question before we get on to this concept of prevention and the reason why you're still luckily with us, not wanting to give up the fight. In the late 1990s, there were a number of lawsuits filed over slave labor and Swiss banking, attempts to get restitution of paintings. But let's just talk about the slave labor for a moment. People think of this as something which took place in 1999, 2000. But you actually were basically the pathfinder for this way back in the 1950s. You went to some of the companies that had employed slave labor in Germany, and you talked to them and got them to at least provide some compensation to those who were still alive, who had labored for them during the war. Can you describe how that happened?
Well, it's best described in a book I wrote called Less Than Slaves. They were less than slaves because a slave is someone you try to preserve to continue working for you. The concentration camp inmates employed by large German industries were being literally worked to death. The Germans planned Vernichtung durch Arbeit, which means destruction through work. And if they couldn't work, they were sent directly to the gas chamber in Auschwitz, for example. And if they were working and they were unable to continue through exhaustion or whatever, they then sent them also. So this was a program designed not to just kill the people as the Einsatzgruppen were doing in the field, but saying, hey, we'll work them to death, it's more efficient. That's what they did. And this book, Less Than Slaves, which won the prize, Harvard University publication, won the prize, the best book on the Holocaust when it came out, has the details of the positions taken by all of these companies without exception. IG Farben, makers of Bayer aspirin, AEG, Siemens, Rheinmetall, a few of the biggest German names took the same position. First of all, we didn't do it, a lie. Secondly, they were treated well, a lie. Third, they were treated the same as German workers, a lie. Fourth, we owe them nothing. After all, if it hadn't been for us, they would have been killed. That's why we kept them alive. We want to be grateful for being worked to death instead of being shot immediately. It was contemptible, the position that they took.
And didn't some of them also argue, okay, we didn't do it, but okay, since you found out that we did do it, we only did it because they made us do it?
Well, that was also an argument. And I went over that with Alfred Spear, who was the armaments minister. He had said,
The German armaments.
The German,
Nazi German.
yes. Under Hitler. He was a friend of Hitler's too. He spent 20 years in Spandau prison. Spandau prison, I visited there. Big fortress in the middle of Berlin, now destroyed. But when he came out, it's the only time I talked to any of those defendants, I asked him that question. I said, how is it that I have your reports saying you have to request the inmates, you have to prove that you are able to prevent them from escaping by having barbed wire, make a concentration camp, you have to make sure you don't feed them too much, and so on. How is it I have all your reports saying what has to be done, and they say we were only forced to do it? So he gave me a very simple answer. He said, they're lying. And I said, I'm going to write a book on this. I was in the process of doing it. And I want to be absolutely correct. Can I send you the manuscript of the book? And I will recount what you have told me. If there's any error, please correct it. He said, I will do that. He had written a best-selling book while he was in 20 years in jail. And I gave him my manuscript, and on these points, he wrote on every page, einverstanden, agreed, agreed, agreed. He didn't change a word.
And this was
This was Albert Spear, convicted Nazi war criminal, sentenced to 20 years in prison. His deputy was sentenced to death and executed. And that also gave rise, how come? The Germans resented the fact that
he was a very close advisor to Hitler.
He was a very close advisor and friend to Hitler, because Hitler wanted to be an architect too. And this Spear was an architect. So they were but his position was, look, I knew what was happening, and I didn't do anything to try to stop it. And so I feel, in a sense, also responsible for Auschwitz. He wrote that in his book, and that's why I went to talk to him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have talked to him at all.
So the argument made by some defense lawyers at Nuremberg, for example, about in the factories especially, people who were prosecuted, slave labor, and the slave labor folks you chatted with afterwards, their position was, if we hadn't used slave labor, as the Nazi government required us to do, we ourselves would have been sent to concentration camps. Any record of that?
Absolutely false. I don't know of a single case of anybody who was sent to a concentration camp because he refused to employ slave labor. Doesn't exist. But they had a different argument. They said not only superior orders, which was a phony argument, because German law, the German military law, does not require you to obey an order unless it's lawful. You're not required to obey an order which is a crime. And in the case of the industrialists, nobody was ordering them to do anything. But the defense raised by some of the top Einsatzgruppen commanders, for example, my number one defendant, Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, who killed 90,000 Jews, according to his report, 90,000, including thousands of children, shot one shot at a time. He said we had to do it in self-defense. That was another argument. Self-defense, where does nobody attacked Germany. Yeah, but we knew that the Bolsheviks, the Russians, the Soviets, they planned to attack us. Therefore, it was necessary in self-defense to preempt that by using all necessary means. Why did you kill all the Jews? Well, because everybody knew the Jews were in favor of the Bolsheviks, First World War. Well, why do you kill their children? If they grew up and they saw that their parents had been eliminated, they would be enemies of Germany. So we have to kill them too. It's natural, isn't it? And why did you kill all the gypsies? Well, nobody trusts the gypsies. They play both sides of the street. So we have to kill them too. That's Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, and I had most of my defendants who were generals. I picked them according to the rank in their education, had doctor's degrees. This was his excuse, which he never regretted and never changed. I visited him in the death house, the only defendant I ever talked to personally, man to man. And he repeated the same arguments after he was sentenced to death. And we both knew he was going to hang. So this was a more serious argument, and it's dangerous because the argument that you have a legal right to preempt somebody who you think is going to attack you, that's very dangerous. But according to the U.S. military code, that's permissible. United States military biennial review of military law. And it's a very dangerous doctrine. And the judges, 3 American judges in that trial, said if everybody was entitled to assume that his neighbor is going to attack him, and then he goes across the street and kills his neighbor and his wife and his children and his grandchildren and his mother, what kind of a world would we have? So the preemptive right to attack, particularly in a nuclear age, is very dangerous to the safety of anybody who lives after I go. So I'd like to warn them that the world is getting to be a very, very dangerous place, much more so as time goes by. And we have to develop new techniques and new ways of finding ways of settling our disputes without the illegal use of armed force. First, it should be clear, the laws which were enacted for compensation and restitution were not limited to Jewish claimants. There was a very nice lady by the name of Caroline Faraday, a devout Catholic lady who had somehow learned about the Polish Catholic women in the Ravensbrück concentration camp who had been used as guinea pigs by the Nazis as part of their medical experiments program. At Nuremberg, we had had a trial against the Nazi doctors for just those activities. Anyway, she came to see me in my New York office and said she'd heard that I was getting compensation for the victims, and could I do anything for these women? Well, I told her that there was a provision in the law, the German compensation law, which I'd been involved in negotiating for, and there was no provision made for compensating people who were not in Germany and who were resident in territories with which Germany had no diplomatic relations, which meant the communist countries were out. I told her I would argue the case because I was known as a specialist in hopeless cases which have a moral content on a contingent fee. In a case like this, there was no fee at all, contingent or not. However, to make a long story short, eventually we did succeed in persuading the Germans to enact a special cabinet decision, became part of the law, providing compensation to victims of medical experiments, even though they had no diplomatic relations with Germany. And the Polish women were, of course, the first beneficiaries of that. The way that worked out was that I persuaded the International Committee of the Red Cross to take on the responsibility. The Germans refused to deal with me. The German cabinet took a dim view of my putting the heat on them. And they did accept the program to do that finally, and not only the Polish women, but any of the women in occupied territory, in territories which there were no diplomatic relations, could file a claim, and did file a claim and get compensation. And I tell the story in one of my many stories on my website, which is www.benferenz.org. It's all there, the details are there. And it was a very touching scene for me. Our plane was late. It was a Polish airline, and there were about 50 women waiting at the airport in the rain, with all carrying flowers which were wilted, and waiting to say thank you. And I was very moved by that. And then the Polish government gave me a car, and they said, "You're our guest, whatever you want to do." And I said, "I just want to see Auschwitz." And so they took me to Auschwitz. I met with the commandant of Auschwitz. I wrote about that too. I had other business with him, connection with the IG Farm claims. It was all very gratifying from my point of view, and for the point of view of the women. They got compensation, and that set precedents for women from Hungary and from Romania and other countries to come file claims, which they did, and it cost the German government very much more than they could have settled with me if they had been so inclined, but they refused. And so it was a historical precedent in that we got a special law to that effect.
One very quick question, and I just want to see you answer it, and that is, you took almost all of these cases pro bono. You didn't get a dime out of it yourself.
That's correct.
And that would surprise a lot of lawyers today, that you were able to do that. How were you able to? I mean,
how could I survive as a lawyer?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I bought some real estate. I invested in stocks and bonds. I bought municipal bonds in New York.
And they didn't default yet.
Hmm?
And they didn't default.
No, they never defaulted, and it's paying 4% tax exempt.
Okay.
Not that I'm recommending what your lawyers should do. And I was very modest. I lived very modestly all my life, still do. And I save money, but I save it for noble causes. I have my old shoes and my old coats and my car. I hope to ride you in it soon. It's only about 19 years old. Most of the parts work. So it's not a way to fame. It's not a way to fame and fortune, really, but not fortune, but I get fame.
I'm getting the impression more of your parts work than your car.
My parts are still working.
Now, in the early 1950s, based on a vote that had taken place in the United Nations in 1948, there was finally in place, at least for signatories, a anti-genocide rule of law, turning genocide, at least for signatories, nations who signed, into an international crime that could be tried. And that was authored by a fellow named Raphael Lemkin, who I understand you had occasion to meet. What was?
I know Raphael Lemkin. He was at Nuremberg. He was hanging around with the Polish delegation usually.
He had been a Polish Jew who had escaped.
He was a Polish Jewish lawyer, very competent lawyer, who gave me a copy of his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Territory. And he was a fanatic, determined that since his entire family had been executed, killed, murdered by the Nazis, that we don't just treat it as ordinary murder. This was murder of a special group for a special reason, and that should have a special name. And after much effort at trying to find the right name, he concluded that genocide was a good name because it was like suicide kills yourself. Genocide kills the genus, the whole group, and that should be condemned.
And he just created that word. It didn't exist
He
before.
created the word, and on his tombstone in Long Island, New York, and I have that published in one of the books. My son went out and took pictures of it. It's Raphael Lemkin, inventor of the term genocide. It was because I knew Raphael Lemkin, and it seemed an appropriate term to help advance the concept of law. It was a word which would attract attention and which people would remember, rather than mass murder or annihilation or anything like that. The presence of a new word describing not a new crime, murder is a new crime, but something directed against a specific group in its totality. We had to approach that kind of action in a different way, or give it a different title. I agreed with him, essentially, that we should have it. I believe some have told me that's the first time the word genocide was ever used in a criminal trial. So the short answer to your question is because I respected Lemkin and wanted to further his objective. Well, it should be borne in mind that the United States took 40 years to ratify the Genocide Convention. And the Genocide Convention really just says a special kind of murder. It gets a special name. But 40 years with every day being pounded home indicates the unfortunate truth that not everybody in the world, not in the United States either, shares the same point of view. And we have to take into account that there is a sizable minority which may be able to block, as they have blocked with the Genocide Convention for 40 years, block the development of the rule of law. And it's up to the young people to recognize that law is much more important than war, And it's the only thing that will protect them against this type of genocide, which Lemkin tried to avoid, and which I am trying to avoid, because the next war is surely going to be genocidal.
Now, slowly but surely, I mean, Lemkin's rule, the one that he managed to get passed by the United Nations, and eventually the U.S. signed on to 40 years after the initial writing of it, it in many ways needed tribunals to implement it. And just at the turn of the new millennium in Rome, there was a creation of the International Criminal Court at a convention. Can you describe what your memory of that was and how you got involved?
My memory of that is very clear. I've written a lot of books on it, called an International Criminal Court, and hundreds of articles. And this was an awareness at the International Military Tribunal, headed by Justice Robert Jackson, who was on our Supreme Court and got leave from the president to be the chief prosecutor for the United States. And after about, I don't know how many millions of people have been killed. Some people say 50 million, but I know from my experience, you never know how many people die in war. They die of heartache, they die of disease, they die, as I've seen them, shoveled into a ditch. But after 50 million or 100 million people had been killed, Jackson tried to lay down the rule that crime is committed by individuals. Law must apply equally to everyone. The supreme international crime is the crime of aggression, because it includes all the other crimes. And whether you call it aggression or you call it crimes against humanity or something else, there's never been a war without massive rape as part of the war. The Russians had it as part of their policy when they got into Berlin, teach them a lesson. And no German woman, and I don't know men either, was safe on the streets from being raped when the Russians came in against that hail of fire which Hitler had built up to try to keep them out, and the Russian troops went into it, piling up on top of their dead bodies. So I don't want to get carried away by emotion. Should be condemned, must be condemned. We live in a very dangerous world where we rely on force to settle our disputes instead of peaceful means, and I'm trying to change that.
I've seen, obviously there's film of when the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was first created, and I do recall a round of applause for you at that event, if I can recall.
The vote will now be closed. The machine is now closed.
The whole overwhelmingly voted in favor of accepting this statute, the Constitution, for the court. And it was an explosion of joy. It was a great victory in my mind for the rule of law, because for the first time since Nuremberg, the first time in human history, a truly international criminal court had been drafted and accepted overwhelmingly by the nations in that room. I've never have had any official position anywhere, and that gives me a big advantage because nobody can fire me, nobody hired me, and so I speak the truth as I see it, and many people stand up and applaud. Then they go about their business because they have a job to keep and a policy to follow and so on. And so it was in Rome when we adopted, over 100 nations agreed to the Rome Statute. I was honored the day before to make a presentation to the entire audience, which I did, a short presentation, 8 minutes or whatever it was, in which I laid it down to them very clearly. Look, let the law take a step forward. Let us rely on law in order to settle our disputes instead of the current system where you sell young people out to kill other young people they don't even know, who never did them any harm, maybe never harmed anybody. And you kill them, as many as you can, until you get tired of killing them, and then you say, we won and we went home. That's a crazy system. And you'd have to have another element in there. So you need not only laws condemning it, as Raphael Lemkin was pinpointing the most horrible of all crimes, but you need courts to carry it out. And Rome took a step forward. And we created that court, the International Criminal Court. But one third element which is necessary is enforcement is still missing. And as long as we have no enforcement, you'll have no peace, my friends. You'll have no peace in the world.
And when you say enforcement, describe what enforcement could look like.
The enforcement could look like what was originally planned after the 100 million or 50 million people were killed. You have universal disarmament, except for the purpose of national internal defense. You have to have an international military force. You have to have independent powers to approve it. That was the Security Council at the time of political necessity. Otherwise, the Russians, the Americans would never have agreed. You need law and courts, and you need the enforcement mechanisms of a judicial system with the usual enforcement of every judicial system, a police force or whatever you want to call it. We haven't begun to build that.
So if someone is convicted today at the International Criminal Court, let's say of crimes, some crime against humanity, some sort of mass murder,
right?
What enforcement mechanism is there to, first of all, bring them to the court, and second of all, if they are convicted, then to go out, say, and gather others who have been equally found guilty?
Essentially, we have none. They would say, yes, we have some. Totally inadequate. Catch Coney 2012 was an appeal sent out because there was an African leader who was very brutal, was killing his own people. Mr. Coney, the prosecutor in the International Criminal Court, Marino Ocampo, was aware of it. But Coney was hiding in the woods, in the wilderness. And he still is hiding in the wilderness. We rely completely. The International Criminal Court depends upon the cooperation from all of its members and other member states. If a man is hiding somewhere in a country which was itself complicit in the crime, we have no police force that can we send in there. The blue helmets of the United Nations, they're not supposed to fire a shot unless it's self-defense. So we lack the enforcement mechanism. And until we recognize that, we won't understand why we can have so-called terrorist groups going around and we can't stop them. There's nothing we can do about it, because we may call him a terrorist because in our opinion he's a very bad guy, but he has a lot of followers who think he's a very good guy and we're the very bad guy. And when we send a drone and it drops a bomb on a house because there's a very bad guy living in that house, but we also kill his wife and his 2 babies and a few of his neighbors, assume he killed only 10 additional people. Every one of them goes out of that house determined for himself and for everybody he knows to try to kill every American he can ever catch. That's the practice today. That's crazy. That's what we do. That doesn't eliminate crime. It encourages crime. We give impunity to the heads of state who are responsible leaders who order these things to take place in the interest, of course, of their view of their country. But good intentions doesn't make something lawful, which is criminal. And there are good intentions on all sides. So we have to eliminate the use of armed force as a technique for settling disputes. It's suicidal, it's genocidal. Lemkin would have disapproved, and there are crimes against humanity prohibited, but we have not listed specifically the illegal use of armed force. I'm saying put it in, because the statute says other inhumane acts are also punishable. And what could be more inhumane than contemporary methods of warfare? Sending in a drone, or today it's worse, warning to the young people. We have the capacity today from cyberspace to cut off the electrical grid on planet Earth. If we do that in any chosen city, everybody in that city is dead. I cannot tell you whether it'll be within a day or a week or a month, but in a few days' time, everybody, if the electrical grid is cut off, is dead. We have that capacity. The United States has the capacity, Russia has the capacity, China has the capacity. How do I know that? I got it when I was at a conference in St. Petersburg, Russia, and the American general and I were having breakfast. It was years ago. By now it has become public knowledge. So I'm not revealing any government secrets. It may not be knowledge to everybody, but everybody in the business knows it. So with this capacity, increasing capacity to kill everybody on the earth, we're going to have genocide of the human race if you don't wake up and turn to law, not war. After Nuremberg, I continued, of course, to be very active in trying to create a permanent international criminal court. And so I was pretty well known to everybody in the business. I wrote articles, I lectured, I came, I nagged them, I had conferences, I set up conferences, etc. So they all knew me. I was actually in Germany at the time doing this kind of thing. I got a letter and a phone call, Luis Moreno Ocampo of Argentina, whether I would do the closing remarks for the prosecution. I've said, of course I will. And so I went. He had sent me a draft of something. I read the draft. I threw it in the garbage. I said it was going to recite, the typical thing, and we proved this, and we proved that, and we proved this, and we proved this, and we proved this, and we proved this. I said, throw it away. I throw it away. And I went, and he gave me a secretary, and I dictated the closing statement. And he said, don't forget to put in that crime against humanity, that it's a plea of humanity to law, plea of humanity to law. I said, Luis, I don't want to be quoting myself. That's bad form. I don't want to be quoting myself. He said, you got to put it in, you got to put it in. I said, okay. That was his contribution. Anyway, everybody was allowed only 10 minutes. They had other prosecutors went before me and all kinds of, their segment of the trial. And I also added something. I said, I will not call him, whatever his name is, first name I've forgotten, Lubanga. I will call him Mr. Lubanga. The man has not been convicted of anything yet. We owe him respect. Okay, okay. I had to read it because it had to be translated. Everything was translated, had to be prepared. The technology is fantastic. Every judge has before him the whole statement. And if it's a judge who prefers another foreign language, they have it all in the foreign language at the same time, simultaneously. So it went over very well, I thought. And that was that.
That concludes the prosecution's submissions on the legal characterisation of the conflict, and I'll hand to Mr. Ferencz now.
Very clear, Mr. McCormack. Thank you very much. Mr. Ferencz?
May it please your honors, this is a historic moment in the evolution of international criminal law. For the first time, a permanent international criminal court will hear the closing statement for the prosecution as it concludes its first case against its first accused, Mr. Thomas Lubango Dila. I witnessed such an evolution. As an American soldier, I survived the indescribable horrors of World War II and served as a liberator of many concentration camps. Shortly thereafter, I was appointed a prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, which mapped new rules for the protection of humanity. I was 27 years old then. I am now in my 92nd year, having spent a lifetime striving for a more humane world governed by the rule of law. I am honored to represent the prosecutor and to share some personal observations regarding the significance of this trial. And Lubanga was convicted. Using child soldiers is a crime, but compared to my Einsatzgruppen, I would never have tried them. So, but they had to get going with something. I said, I talked to the staff, can't you find something better than child soldiers? I got mass murders going around, torture, rape, and so on. They said, we don't have the evidence for the reasons which Professor Friedman Goldman has pointed out, that we don't have cooperation from the people in the field, and they can go away and hide. And what are you going to do? We have no enforcement. So we take a guy who's, by the Einsatzgruppen standards, nothing. We didn't prove that he personally killed anybody. But nevertheless, it's a crime, and it's good to be condemned. It should be condemned as a crime, because people today are still seizing child soldiers, and I think there is some deterrent effect. Since we're talking about the deterrent, I'm going to intrude on your time with which a question you didn't ask me. How do I know that it'll have any deterrent effect? Because it has already had a deterrent effect. When Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, came back from a visit to Washington, he called his cabinet together and said, I had a meeting with the President of the United States. I was asked if we're with him or against him, and they have decided that in Iraq they got to change the government. And so what could I tell him? I said, of course, England is with you. And so he has all this cabinet there, and the general in charge of sending the troops said, just a moment, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm not giving you verbatim, but that's the sense of what it was. I have the text. It was published in The Guardian, so if those who want to check it. He said, I spent a lot of time getting Mr. Milosevic in the dock for the International Criminal Tribunal Yugoslavia crime. He said, I don't want to send my troops in to get killed without knowing that it's legal. Hurrah! Law steps in and a general says, I won't go unless it's legal. Right there made my efforts worthwhile. And then what happened? Also informative. He said, well, get a legal opinion. So they go for a legal opinion. And the great expert of the British Foreign Office, was a lady by the name of Elizabeth Wilmshurst, who I knew quite well, because when I was at the UN presenting all these arguments and papers in an unofficial capacity always, she would oppose my attempt to condemn aggression, say it has to be a war, otherwise it's not aggression. And she was taking a very conservative position. We didn't get along very well. That was the American position. And she sat right next to Robert Rosenstock, the American representative. Anyway, Elizabeth Wilmshurst writes an opinion. She says, I cannot support a government that's engaged in the crime of a war of aggression. I resign. She'd been in the Foreign Service for 30 years. I saw that. Bravo, Lizzie, you finally got the point. What, so the Prime Minister says, what am I going to do? I told the President of the United States we're with him. We got to do something. Goldsmith, I think his name was, the Attorney General says, we get another opinion. So they went to another opinion. And the other opinion, I think Goldsmith wrote the opinion, Attorney General, said an argument could be made that it was lawful. Of course an argument can be made that kicking your mother in the head is lawful. He said an argument can be made. And with that, the cabinet approved it. And we went to war in Iraq. The United States committing aggression, in my opinion. We were not at war with Iraq before.
Now, the United States is a signatory of the Genocide Convention, but not of the International Criminal Court. The Genocide Convention is, as I said, written by Raphael Lipkin and passed and finally accepted by the United States, does seem to have in it a certain requirement, an obligation imposed on every country that's signed onto it. How do you interpret that? For example, just something relatively contemporary. Let's just say ISIS going after the Azizi in Iraq, Syria. If it is concluded by all experts that this is an example of an attempted genocide, is there any obligation that falls on a signatory like the United States to the Genocide Convention to act, or is it just that we go tut tut tut, don't do that?
There certainly is a moral obligation, not only on the United States, but on everyone, to behave in a humane way. And that goes back to the first peace conference in 1898 and before. People are supposed to behave like human beings and don't go around killing people just because you don't agree with them. And the Genocide Convention is full of loopholes. Read an article by Professor Louis Henkin of Columbia University analyzing it when it first came out. And all of these things have loopholes in them saying, except if our national interests are at stake or our honor is at stake. You can't have loopholes like that. And there is a moral obligation, but as long as there is no legal obligation, you have no way of putting them in jail. Now, certainly, the criminal law deters some crimes. It doesn't eliminate all crime. We still have robbers and rapists and murderers. But if we didn't have any criminal law, you can be sure that that rate would be very much higher than it is today. So it has some deterrent effect. But for the illegal lawmaking, nobody gets tried. The head of state, he's immune because he's the head of state, he's a sovereign state, or he's hiding in the woods and they won't cooperate with you if he had been deposed. So we have to change our way of thinking and recognize that the illegal use of armed force is a crime. It's a crime against humanity because the interests of the whole world are involved, and it's punishable. And we need a court, and we need a prison, and we need soldiers to go in and catch him and put him in jail if he's found guilty. If he's innocent, let him state his case. Oh, you're going to make a presentation.
In 1959, one of the companies that you, after Farben, one of the companies you went to try to get some sort of reparations for slaves who'd toiled for them under horrific conditions during the war was the Krupp Company.
Yes.
I have here in my hand the annual Loyola Law School Center for the Study of Law and Genocide Raphael Lemkin Award, which we try to give out every year to someone whose achievements through life are exemplify the man Raphael Lemkin and the goals of trying to in some way prevent future genocide. As you so eloquently just said, no law is going to ever stop all killing, but laws have a certain effect. They can,
deterrent,
as they can, stay the hand of some killers just by fear that perhaps there'll be consequences to it. Without consequences, there isn't nearly as much deterrence. But one of the points I wanted to make is, in giving you this award, I'd just like you to know that when you successfully navigated that minefield that was the Krupp Company, because they continually denied any responsibility, and they finally agreed to send restitution checks only to the Jews. They refused to send them to non-Jews because I always found their explanation why they couldn't give it to non-Jews after they settled with you for the Jewish survivors. Their explanation was, well, we gave so much money to the Jews, we don't have any left. And it turned out it was 1/5 of 1% of the corporate value that was turned over in total reparations. So the idea they couldn't then pay non-Jewish slave laborers was ridiculous. But it's very significant for me personally to be able to give you this award because, as it happens, my mother was one of those slaves who'd worked for the Krupp Corporation, and when she received her check, I was her only son, and she was a single mother, and although it wasn't a lot of money, it came in very handy. And so on behalf of my mother and myself, the other almost exclusively women, by the way.
Yes, there were 550 women.
Yes, my mother was one of them.
Yes,
the women who worked for Krupp, because he preferred women workers. I think he thought they were less trouble and they had better manual dexterity than men. He used them in his factories. On behalf of all of them, departed and still with us, as well as Loyola Law School, I would like to present you, Ben Ferencz, with the 2015 Raphael Lemkin Award, and with the $5,000, if I might, honorarium that goes with it. And I think it is our great honor to be able to present this to you. I think you're doing us a great favor by agreeing to accept it. I just really want to thank you, and I hope that I can give you again, be the only person to ever get 2 of them. If I can do this again in 10 years, we can meet here again and do it.
Well, I am very touched by this award, and particularly by the story of your mother. My wife would have been one of those Hungarian girls, because I knew the case very well, and I knew some of the people who did survive. And it was quite outrageous for reasons which are detailed maybe in the book, but that a company like Krupp, rich, powerful, reneged and felt no moral obligation whatsoever to compensate them. They finally were browbeaten into it, and I'm sure they treated it as Jewish blackmail rather than recognize their moral obligation to do something for these girls who were taken from their homes, forced to work in the equivalent of a concentration camp, day and night toiling without food, without adequate protection of any kind. And many of them died. Some survived and received this very meager thing which we were able to squeeze out of them. So I'm delighted by the honor which Loyola University has paid to me to tribute my friend Raphael Lemkin, who made a significant contribution to the thinking about international crimes and war. And I assure you that this money will be very well spent, not for me, but for the cause. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
I'll stand up except the camera is in place.